I was trained as a teacher, and I qualified in the early 60s. And I started teaching in a comprehensive school in Southampton. But after a couple of years, I got a post in a special unit in Southampton, which was giving experience to children who were school phobics, children who couldn't make it to school, who had mental health issues. And amongst those children were some children with autism. And at that stage, autism was a very new word. Nobody knew what autism was about. And so it was a very early stage that I was beginning to understand about autism and how it affected children. Most of the children I worked with then had high IQs, but were very disturbed by autism and couldn't make it into school. And nobody really understood. Shortly after that, my husband got a contract in New Zealand to work for a year. And so I went to New Zealand with him with 3 small children, which was no mean feat. And I worked then in a school for children who were resident in a hospital, so a long stay hospital for children with special needs. And amongst those children, again, were some children with really severe problems associated with autism. So the pattern began to develop. And I came back to England, which is in the middle 1970s. I applied for a job in Southampton and worked for the Hampshire Autistic Society as a deputy head of the school. So I did that for 5 or 6 years, and then became a head of a special school in Winchester, which was a day school. And I'd got used to being in residential school, and I knew that you could do more in residential education. So I then worked for a big residential organisation in Berkshire. And then one day, one of the inspectors phoned me and said, "We'd really like you to go and have a look at this school in Sheffield on Loddon, because we think the school is going to close, but we'd like you to give some advice." So I got to know the school, and then one day they phoned me up and said, "We're going to close our school. Do you want it for your kind of children?" And so we went to the bank, we went to various banks, and they said, "Well, you need some money to invest." And we said, "We don't have money." And then we went to the NatWest Bank, and they said, "We'd be really happy to support you." And so in 1988, not having run a business before, neither of us having been in business, we decided to start a school. My husband was an architect, which was really helpful. The school needed lots of work. For example, there was no water in the kitchen and just a coke-fueled Arga to cook on. So it was quite ancient, and there was lots of work to do. So I wrote a one-page sheet to all the local authorities around Berkshire, Hampshire, and said, "I'm going to start this school for children with autism and challenging behaviour who need 52-week-a-year boarding and who don't have anywhere to go at the moment. They've probably been excluded from lots of schools." So the Department for Education wrote to me and said, "We know that you could run a school, but we don't think there's going to be enough children to make it a viable business." Anyway, I still went ahead. At that stage, Smith Hospital in Reading was closing down. And so our first child that we took was the last child that was being placed from there, so their most difficult, problematic child. And he came to us as our first child. My husband had followed my career and was really interested, but when we started taking the children in at Loddon, he said, "I don't know what you're doing now, this is too much." However, we persevered. Really what I wanted to do was to turn the curriculum upside down. In all the work that I'd done in the local authorities, I'd been advised that you have to keep on pressing children to get it right. And if they don't get it right, you have to keep nagging them. It was called behaviour modification. But I decided that we'd turn it around the other way, and that we'd praise children for when they did get it right, and we would not work with what they got wrong, but we would expand their horizons by what they got right. So it was a complete turnaround from what was going on in other schools. At that stage, Hampshire as an education department didn't recognise autism. So we said that we would take children with learning difficulties, communication problems, and who were disturbed. And so in the first 3 months we had 250 referrals. And the Department for Education wrote to me and said, we were wrong and you were right. So we were really the first school. Loddon School was the first school that worked in this kind of way, using positive behaviour supports. It was the first school nationally. First school of any sort of school in the country to get quality management certification. So we did lots of things in the early days which were really significant and started us off on the right track. SCIPr, the programme SCIPr, when I was working in one of the big organisations, I was really worried about the way children and young adults were manhandled. It didn't seem right, and I didn't think that often it was necessary at all. People dived in and pulled children around, put them on the floor, held them on the floor, and it was alien to what I wanted to do. So I began to write a programme of how was a good way to handle children who were out of control, and then came across the programme in New York. So I went to New York to look at their programme and shared with them my ideas. And so they modified their curriculum and we used a lot of their work for ourselves. In those early days, we were using significant amounts of physical intervention. And now we have moved to a place where we use virtually none. And really by concentrating on positive behaviour supports, we often don't need it except in a big emergency. So that programme now, because it became so popular, we now have as a separate organisation, and we have 750 instructors teaching that throughout the UK, as well as 6 in Zambia for our work in Zambia. So it is a huge project now and has influenced in no small way the direction of care in the UK for people like our children. So we started the school rapidly became full, and soon children were growing up, and so our first child, who we'd taken from Smith's Hospital, was due to leave. And we found a place for him way up the country that would take him. We gave them some training. We were hopeful that it would work. But when we visited 3 months later, it surely wasn't working. And he had lost weight, he had no possessions. The people that were living with him had mental health issues, were smoking. He was not being looked after. So we came home and decided to buy a house and start a company for adults. And so that's how our first house, which was Cornfields, was started. We went to look at it, and there were other people looking at this house. And Tim, my husband, said to the owners, send these people away, we'll pay you cash, we'll buy it now. And so we bought our first house. And Kathy and Pam, who still work for me, who'd worked for me at Loddon School, became the first people responsible for running that home. So there are people who've worked for me now since we started the Loddon School who are still working either in the school or here at Liaise. And then, of course, once you open one home, very quickly you need to open another one and another one. And so now we have 9 homes, and we're looking to open another one shortly. So we're looking after almost 40 young adults now.